In our A&P class, let's now move into Chapter 12, where we discuss the central nervous system. If you recall from Chapter 11, the central nervous system is going to be made up of your brain and your spinal cord. This is a rather long chapter, so I'm going to divide this audio lecture into several different parts so it'll be a little bit easier for you to follow. As we discuss the chapter, first lecture is going to be on the cerebral hemispheres. The cerebral hemispheres are the very outer parts of your brain. It makes up the bulk of your brain. The second audio lecture will cover the deeper parts of the brain, including the diencephalon, shown here in purple, the brain stem, shown here in green, and the cerebellum, shown in your darker brown color. And then the final audio lecture for this chapter will cover the spinal cord, which is divided into your center gray matter and the external white matter. As we follow through the different parts of the central nervous system, we see a trend with our white matter and our gray matter. If you recall, white matter consists of neurons that are myelinated, surrounded by, since this is the central nervous system, oligodendrocytes to provide an insulation for your transmission of nerve impulses. Gray matter consists of neurons that lack that myelin sheath. As we look through the entire nervous system, central nervous system, we're going to see a central core that is composed of gray matter. Up here, this is a picture of the cerebellum, the brain stem, spinal cord. So we can see the gray matter is always on the inside. When you are looking at gray matter, you need to remember this is going to be an area where the signals transmitted from one neuron to the other are not going to have quite as far to go. Surrounding the gray matter in each area of the central nervous system is the white matter. The white matter is myelinated, and therefore this is going to be the area where we're going to see transmission of impulses that go over a longer distance. In the brain and the cerebellum, with the exception of the brainstem, we often see an outer cortex of gray matter that can have some specialized function. Within our brain, we have ventricles. Ventricles are continuous with one another. These are fluid-filled cavities lined by ependymal cells. The ependymal cells are the cells that produce the fluid called cerebrospinal fluid. In the human brain, we have 4 ventricles. If we look at a picture, we have 2 lateral ventricles shown here. One ventricle that runs down the center portion of the brain, the third ventricle, and then coming further down, we have the 4th ventricle. The 4th ventricle lies in the middle of the brain stem. The lateral ventricles are separated into an anterior horn and an inferior horn. Looking here from a front view and now from a side view. Here's your anterior horn of the lateral ventricles and the posterior horn of the lateral ventricles. The 3rd ventricle is connected to the 4th ventricle by the cerebral aqueduct. Now I'd like to begin looking at the first major portion of the brain, the cerebrum. The cerebrum makes up the bulk part of the brain. That's the part of the brain you think of when you think of what a brain looks like, the wrinkly parts on the outside. The cerebrum is separated into 2 hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. As we look at both of these hemispheres, we see many ridges and indentations or grooves. Every time we have a ridge or a bump in the tissue making the cerebrum, we call this a gyrus. Multiple are called gyri. The indentions or the grooves are going to be called sulci. If these sulci are very deep, then they are called fissures. I'm going to now flip to a picture to describe the rest of the words on this slide. When we're looking at an overall picture of the brain, we can see all the many wrinkles. When we focus here, you can see the very outer edge of the cerebrum is that gray matter we were discussing a few moments ago. And as you go a little bit deeper, then you see white matter. At the top, we have a hill, then a valley. then a hill, then a really, really deep valley, then a hill. Each one of these hills is a gyrus. This valley is not very deep, so it's a sulcus. This valley here is very deep, so it's going to be a fissure. There are two important fissures that you need to know. The longitudinal fissure runs along the mid-sagittal section of the brain, separating the brain into right and left hemispheres. The transverse cerebral fissure separates the cerebrum, the large part here, from this other part of the brain, the cerebellum. As we look at the area that is filled with gyri and sulci, we can separate the brain into different lobes. The area shown in red is the frontal lobe. The area shown in dark blue is a parietal lobe. The frontal lobe is separated from the parietal lobe by the central sulcus. The area here in purple is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is separated from the frontal and parietal lobes by the lateral sulcus. The very back portion of the cerebrum is called the occipital lobe. It is separated from the parietal lobe by the parieto-occipital sulcus. There is another lobe to the cerebrum, but it is located underneath. If you could imagine taking your fist and sitting the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes like a cap on top of your fist, the location of the fifth lobe, the insula, would be where your fist is. Now we're going to start looking at different regions of the cerebrum, talking about what the name of each region is, and also talking about the function of each region. As we look at the cerebrum, we're going to start on the outside and move our way in. The cerebral cortex is a very thin, just outside layer of the cerebrum made up of exclusively gray matter. Your cerebral cortex is the site of your conscious mind. This is the area that makes you a human. This is ultimately the area, your executive suite. This is where everything comes in and you really think about things. This is what allows you to perceive all the sensations from the outside of your body. This is the part of your brain that initiates most of the motor responses you have in your body. It's also the area where we store memories, we understand, the area where we store a lot of our personality. It's a very important part of your brain. As we look at all of this, I need you to remember that any time we're talking about something happening on the temporal lobe, it happens on both temporal lobes. But whatever is on your left side of your body is controlled by the right side of your brain. Whatever's on the left side of your body is controlled by the right side of your brain. The areas of the cerebral cortex are separated functionally into three types. We have motor areas. The motor areas are going to be areas that supply neurons and send information directly to muscles. These will be areas for efferent motor neurons. We're going to send impulses away from the brain. Sensory areas are going to be areas for afferent neurons. This is going to be the area of the brain that we receive sensation input from the outside of the brain. And then we have association areas. Association areas are the areas where we really think about things. This is where all of your integration really occurs. Shown here are the list of the different functional areas of the cerebral cortex. An easy thing to do is to start at your central sulcus and go forward. As we go forward, each of the areas here in red represent motor areas. Back to the central sulcus, as we go back, each of the areas in blue represent a sensory area. Anything that is in pink is going to be what we call a multimodal association area, where you're going to have a whole lot of stuff going on. Okay? As I talk about this, you may choose to flip through your next few slides. Everything that I'm saying should be written on these slides. As we look at our motor areas, we have 4 motor areas. we have the primary motor area, and then in front of that, the premotor cortex. These areas are found on the precentral gyri. Your primary motor area receives information that you need to make a movement. So this is where you're going to decide, I need to move my leg. The information, move your leg, comes from the primary motor cortex. The premotor cortex helps you decide how to move your leg. To give you an example of how these two work together, if I did not have a premotor cortex and I began walking up and down the stairs, as I went to walk up the stairs, all I would be able to do is just pick my leg up and then just wait for it to hit the steps. And you've probably all done that accidentally, not thinking about it, walking up the steps, and maybe it's a little lower or higher than you thought and you kind of stumbled. If you didn't have a premotor area, you would walk like that every time. But since you have a premotor area, after your primary motor cortex is sending information to move, the premotor cortex tells your leg how to move. The premotor cortex is also where we store things such as how to do repeated learned tasks like playing a piano, something real specific. Broca's area that's outlined here by the dashes, it's still in red, is a motor area. This is the motor area for your speech. The Broca's area allows you to move your mouth so you can talk. It has nothing to do with deciding what you're going to say. It just allows you to talk. Now as we go back and we look at our sensory areas, we have the primary somatosensory cortex, then the somatosensory association cortex. The primary somatosensory cortex allows us to receive information that I felt something. The somatosensory association cortex allows us to know what we are feeling. Somatic senses are going to be things like touch, temperature, pain, those sorts of things. So to give you an example of how this works, if I put a key in my hand and I didn't know what was being put in my hand, so someone puts a key in my hand, the information that something is there goes to my primary somatosensory cortex. Then my somatosensory association cortex allows me to pull from my memories to figure out what is in my hand without looking at it. And think about how you would do that. You would feel the weight, the texture, the size, anything that would allow you to figure out that you had a key in your hand. If we keep going back, we have the primary visual cortex in the occipital lobe, and then the visual association area. Primary visual cortex just allows you to receive information that you see something. The visual association area allows you to think about what it is you're seeing. So primary visual cortex, you look at someone, you see them. Visual association area, you look at them and you know that's Bob. You know who you're talking to. You go to a memory to make the link. Hearing works the same way. We have a primary auditory cortex and we have an auditory association area. It's going to be located right here in the center portions of your temporal lobe. Outlined here by these black dashes is another area that allows us to help us with our speech. This is called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area allows us to think about what we want to say. So if you've ever met someone that had a stroke, they may have one of two things, and they have lots of things depending on the area of the brain that's affected. But have you ever been around someone that was a stroke victim that maybe they know what they want to say, but they just can't get the words to come out of their mouth, and a lot of times they get real frustrated. People like this would have their Wernicke's area working, but not their Broca's area. On the other hand, if they could open their mouth and just physically jabber and make sounds, well, then their Broca's area is fine, but their Wernicke's area is not okay. That's because now they can't think of what they want to say. In the very front of the brain, we call this the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is where we have our memory, task management, problem solving. The prefrontal cortex is what makes you a human. This is where your personality is located. Even though we can't see it, remember there's another area underneath all of this called the insula, that extra lobe. The insula is where you have your area for taste. And just like with vision and hearing and somatic senses, you have an area that's your primary area, you taste something, then your gustatory association area allows you to figure out what you've tasted. In addition to these major areas that I just went through, there are a few other areas that are not located on the picture. You have areas of your brain within the insula that are considered your visceral sensory areas, and this is going to be the area where you perceive sensations that are coming from your viscera, such as your stomach, your bladder. So if you have your stomach's hurting or your bladder's full and you need to go to the restroom, those areas are going to be perceived. Those sensations will move to your insula and go to your visceral sensory area. Also in the insula we have our vestibular cortex, which allows us to have conscious awareness of our balance. We're also going to see some of this in our cerebellum as we go a little further. Believe it or not, that is the part of your cerebral cortex that is fairly easy to explain. The harder to explain areas of your cerebral cortex are called multimodal association areas. These are areas where different parts of your cerebral cortex work together to accomplish a task. There's not really just one part of your cerebral cortex you can point to on a picture and say the multimodal association area is here. It's more of a how do all of these things work together. The three parts of your multimodal association areas are your anterior association area. This is what I was referring to as your prefrontal cortex. The anterior association area allows you to have your intellect, regardless of what level, recall, your personality, your judgment, different things like that. Your posterior association area is going to be a combination of different areas that allow you to do things like remember who someone is by looking at their face, or recognizing a pattern, and then that allows you to, so if you recognize a pattern of how certain things are set up, certain chairs, you may recognize, oh, this looks like an auditorium. So just things of that nature. The third one, your limbic association area, this is the area of your emotional brain. There's many different areas that are part of this that you use memories you have established that help you decide how you feel about certain things. I talked about this just a little bit already when I was describing to you that the things that happen on the left side of your body are controlled by the right side of your brain, and the things that happen on the right side of your body are controlled by the left side of your brain. This is what we call the lateralization of function. Typically, people are going to have one side of their brain that is more dominant than the other. The easiest way to see this is by looking at whether someone is right-handed or left-handed. If someone is right-handed, which side of their brain do you think is dominant? Typically, this would be someone that has the left hemisphere of their brain dominant. That's why they're using their right hand. They're sending impulses from their brain to their right hand much more easily, so that's why they can do things more efficiently with the right side of their hand. Most of the time, people that are more controlled by their left hemisphere are going to be much better at things like math, logic, organization, those sorts of skills. A lot of times, on the other side, people that are left-handed, they're going to have more dominance in their right hemisphere. And a lot of times, these are going to be the people that are slightly more artistic, and they have better ability to be creative and think out of the box and those natures. Now we're going to stay in the cerebrum to finish this lecture, and we're going to look at what's going on in the cerebral white matter. So remember, we're leaving just that superficial gray matter, that cortex, and we're just going a little bit deeper into the white matter. The cerebral white matter is responsible for communication between the diencephalon and the cerebral cortex. So in this area, you're going to have different tracks. Recall, those are collections of axons in the central nervous system moving information in different directions. Each of these tracks is going to have a name depending on the direction that the tract is carrying information. You have commissures, association fibers, and projection fibers. If we look at this picture here, I think it explains it a lot better than looking at words. This is a coronal section of the human brain, and we're looking from the anterior towards the posterior. So we're looking front to back. When we look here, we can see in the very center, this blue, this is going to be the ventricles. We can see at the very edge, we have the cerebral gray matter that we were discussing a few moments ago. In the white matter, you see all the lines drawn. The green lines represent the areas where you're going to have the commissural fibers. These fibers connect the left brain with the right brain. So they allow both sides of the brain to communicate with each other. The pink or red color here, this represents what we call association fibers. They allow information to be sent from one area of the cerebral cortex to another. So if we think about what's going on in the cerebral cortex, if we can understand that my premotor cortex needs to be able to communicate with my primary motor cortex, because my premotor cortex is going to tell my primary motor cortex how to move that muscle. So the information is sent from one area to the next by association fibers. It should make sense to you that not only does each side of my brain need to know what's going on and different parts of the gray matter, the lower level parts of my brain, meaning the areas inferior to my cerebrum, need to be aware and need to be able to send information in this direction. So I have projection fibers. Projection fibers send information from the very edges of your cerebral cortex through your cerebral white matter, down your brainstem, and out your spinal cord. They can also come back up in the opposite direction. From that same picture, you should have recognized that there was some other colors located in the center instead of just the tracks. Remember, anywhere you have a collection of axons called tracks, you must also have a collection of cell bodies. In the central nervous system, a collection of cell bodies is going to be called a nucleus. In this area, your nuclei are going to have some important functions. There's a couple of them that you need to know the name of. We have the caudate nucleus and the lentiform nucleus. These nuclei are going to be responsible for helping you get your muscular control just right, helping you to regulate your attention and cognition, and also not just helping you keep your motor functions accurate and correct, but also inhibiting any unnecessary movements that you don't want to make. If we look at a side view of the brain, showing you on the inside, this is where your caudate nucleus is going to be located, and this is where your lentiform nucleus is going to be located. They're located in the very center, and you can see how the projection fibers will run up, and they have to go in through these nuclei to continue. Now this is a horizontal section of the brain, and we can see it a little bit better. You can still see these commissural fibers. The corpus callosum is just the name of this particular one. You can still see your ventricles, but outlined in pink shows you the lentiform nucleus and the caudate nucleus. I'm going to conclude the first audio lecture here, and we will pick back up with the diencephalon.